So today we have Alex Salazar. Thank you so much for coming. He is a partner at Neotribe Ventures, an early stage deep tech venture firm. Before becoming a venture capitalist, he was the founder CEO of Stormpath, acquired by Okta, where he built an authentication API service for developers and grew a bottom-up model that attracted thousands of developers every week. So Alex, thanks for coming, and I'll let you get started.
Awesome. Well, pleasure to meet everybody. I give this talk on finding your first 5 customers pretty frequently, and the reason I do it is that it's one of the hardest things that early stage founders have to tackle. And so this presentation I'm going to walk you through is really the lessons I learned when I was in your shoes, and the lessons that I've kind of sharpened in working with other founders at the similar stage that you might be at today. So with that, I will tell you a little bit about Neotribe. We already got the intro, so thank you for that. Just to kind of recap, we are an early stage venture capital firm. And what we look for is we like to invest really early in these breakthrough technologies, things that have the potential, if they work out, to really change the world. And what makes us different than most other venture firms is that we're entrepreneurs at heart, right? 2/3 of the partnership are former founder CEOs who've had very successful outcomes and have seen the full cycle of starting and building companies. So with that, let's dive in. So, I like to start this conversation kind of explaining the weird nuance of the early stage. Everybody talks about sales, and then you'll also hear some people talk about customer discovery. And both of those functions, both of those activities are incredibly important to early stage companies. But when you're trying to find your first customers, when you're trying to sell those first, guinea pigs, the process is not one or the other. It's actually a hybrid of the two. And that's a hard, weird nuance that, many entrepreneurs figure out too late. And that's ultimately what I'm here to demystify and try and give you at least an opinion or my own framework for how to proceed with that combination. And so the way I'll break down the conversation is, there's going to be 3 parts of this talk. The first is really an explanation of how customers buy, so that you can have empathy for their process and understanding for their process, so you can properly navigate it and be efficient with their time and your time, but also not waste your time if something's not going to work out. Once we understand how customers buy, I'll then walk you through how to build and execute an outreach plan. How are you going to get in front of all of these potential customers whom you might ultimately convince to buy your product? And as you do an outreach plan, as you execute your outreach plan, you're invariably going to get meetings with customers. And so I'll walk through how to manage those conversations to get the most out of them and really identify who are the real candidates to be your first customers, so you don't waste your time on the wrong people. So let's start with how customers buy. The most important thing that I like to get into people's heads, especially first-time entrepreneurs, is that customers really only buy things for which they have an active need, which is a fancy way of saying they only buy things that are high priority. And especially if you're selling to organizations, it's incredibly difficult for an organization to make a purchase of any real substance on its own, because it's a complex organization. There are many buyers. And so anything that's not a high priority need typically just doesn't make the cut and doesn't get bought. People are just way too busy to process low priority needs. And so there's this terminology called active need and need. And so a need is really basic. You guys know what that is, right? It's something that, there's a problem in the organization. Something's not good enough. An active need is that, but the customer is committed to doing something about it. They care. It's a priority. They've probably already talked about the pain internally and realize that it's a really big problem, and they all know they want to do something, whether or not they've found a solution. And so when you talk to your customers, and we'll talk more about this in the later slides, what you're looking for is active needs. I'll leave one last point here. Really common trap for technical founders is that they'll convince themselves that they have a business because they know that all the customers have a pain point, but then they're not finding customers that have those pain points. And then they believe that if they just have better marketing or better sales, they can convince customers of the pain that they have and that they want to go solve it. That tends to not work out very well. What tends to work out really well is that you find this really active pain that customers have, and then you orient your messaging, your product, and your sales around discovering and exploiting that active need. So if you ever have bought something, think about, a pair of shoes that you bought, or a car, or anything else, you went through a pretty standard buying process, whether you're a consumer or an enterprise. And it looks something like this. I'll use your car. You've got it, maybe you already have a car today, and your car is working fine, but something happened that got you thinking about getting a new car. Maybe it's a 2-wheel drive car and now it's winter and now you're like, you're spinning out in the snow. Or maybe you saw an ad on TV for a really cool car. Or maybe you had a child and you realized that your sports car is no longer, maybe might not be the right car for you anymore, but something happened to get you to think about whether or not you want to get a new car. And so people call that loosening the status quo. And then once you got in that mindset, then you probably stopped and thought, hey, I need a new car. What do I need? Do I need a car that goes really fast and looks really cool? Or do I need a larger car that can store a bunch of my camping equipment? Or, maybe I need a minivan to fit my family. And you start, what's my price point? How much am I willing to spend? You start going in your mind through this process to really recognize your needs. Like, what are your requirements for this next purchase? And then once you have a sense for what it is you need and what you can afford and when you want it, then you probably started to look at your options. You went online, you started to go to all the major car brands to see what kind of cars they had. You started to play with their websites. Maybe you went to a dealership to look at what they had in inventory. And then once you had an understanding of what your options were and what may or may not be a fit, you probably said, what, this one car or these 2 or 3 cars in particular feel like they're the best fit. I'm going to go test drive them. And that's when you went to go evaluate the alternatives. You went to go spend time to see if these cars really were what you thought they were for you. And then once you went through that test drive, you then said, what, this one in particular is the one I want. And then you made a purchase decision, and then you worked with the sales rep at the dealership to go negotiate the right price and transact, pay, do all the legal work, anything that was required to actually purchase the car. And then once you were done, you drove off the lot. That process is almost identical to a large organization buying, data warehouse software, to a consumer buying a new pair of shoes, to any other purchase process. But it's especially true in large organizations because they actually tend to have these as regimented steps within the buying department. What's also important about how customers buy in particular businesses, but this is true even with consumers to a degree for large purchases, is that there's often more than one person who's making a decision. So a really good example is a car purchase again, right? Let's say there's a teenager who's getting their first car. They probably have a really big say in that decision, but it's not just up to them, right? It's also up to their parent to decide. And that parent also has their own set of requirements and their own set of biases. The same is true in an organization. So, if you were to go to, sell to Goldman Sachs and you were talking to, the head of software architecture about your new technology, that person might get very excited, but they might only be the influencer. There's somebody else who's writing the check. They're the economic buyer. That economic buyer may ultimately report to someone else, or maybe have someone on their team who is the ultimate decision maker. And then there's, of course, going to be the users, the people who are going to be interacting with the product on a regular basis. They may or may not have a big voice. But understanding that in any purchase decision, there is this buying unit is really important. Within these buying units, it is critically important to figure out who is going to be your champion. And a champion is a critically important thing in sales, because this is the person who's going to care so much about what you are selling, that they're the ones who are going to be selling on your behalf internally when you're not there. And so again, we use a car example. There's a teenager who's going to get their first car. They are not the decision maker. They are not the economic buyer. Chances are their parents are filling both of those roles, but they get to influence, and they're the ones who ultimately drive the car. And so if they really, really want that Volkswagen Jetta, even though the Volkswagen rep is not going to be part of any of those household conversations, that teenage driver is going to be constantly trying to advocate for the Jetta to their parents on a regular basis. They're the ones who are going to pull up the safety reports and pull up, all of the analyst reports on how great of a car this is. They're going to price shop it, and they're going to be petitioning and advocating that they want that car instead of maybe some of the other cars that are part of the alternative set. In a large organization, that same thing is also true. So you want to figure out who's the champion. There's a lot of thoughts on how to do this. An easy one for me is, who's the person who's feeling the most pain? Who's the person who has that most active need? Maybe you're selling an advanced database. Is it the developer who can't deliver his feature set because the databases he has available just don't meet the requirements? Or maybe it's the data scientist who's trying to run all kinds of advanced queries, and the database they have available doesn't work, so you're going to jerry-rig a bunch of custom code. Who's the person feeling the most pain? That's your champion, and you want to identify that person, because everything else in the process we're going to walk through kind of hinges on you getting close enough to the mark on who's feeling the pain the most. So now that we know how customers buy, we know how organizations have these buying units that you're going to have to manage. And then within that buying unit, there's ultimately going to be somebody who's going to care the most and is ultimately going to be your representative internally. Now we're going to design an execution plan for outreach. How do we then go out to the world, find all these potential champions and potential customers, and try and get a hold of them and to talk about our product? And so the first part of this is figuring out your message. What is it you're going to say to these people to get them to take a meeting with you? And today, I find that there are basically two different ways you're going to reach out to people that work best. One of them is LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a fantastic outreach tool. It is a foundational tool for almost all professional sales reps, and it's very easy for it to be a foundational tool for you as well. The other one is good old email, right? Email works fantastic. And so we're going to create messages for both of those. But at the heart of those messages is the core foundation, which is, what is it your product does? So let's start with what your product does. Here are some examples of messages that I've worked on. I'll let you read them really quick. Now, what you notice on both of these, on all three of these, is that they're short and sweet. They're one line, and they explain what the product is. We don't get into a ton of explanation of all the benefits and ROI just yet. We're just trying to be very, very clear on what it is the product does, what it is. And to the degree that it makes sense, we're trying to cut out jargon. Now, you can't always avoid jargon. There's some jargon that's really important. Like, in the bottom two, we're using things like auth and cloud. Depending on your audience, that's pretty self-explanatory. But you want to be as limited as you can in jargon, because you don't always know if the person on the other end is going to know what it means. But for what you're building, for what you're designing, think really hard about, how do I get it down to be one very descriptive, non-jargony, non-hypey line about what it is. And then once you have that, you're going to build out a LinkedIn connection message. Now, I have personally found that sending out LinkedIn connection messages, which are free, with a personalized note is very effective. And you want to keep it short and sweet. And there's really different ways you can write these messages. And I have two really good examples here. In the first one, the message is about the product. It's, hey, here's what this product does. I'd love to show it to you and get your feedback on it. The other one is more about you, right? So this bottom one's one that I actually used myself when I was an early stage founder in your shoes. Hey, I'm, a Stanford graduate. In your case, I'm a CMU graduate, and I'm working on this project. Can you give me some time and give me some feedback? And so whether you want to put the product first or you want to put you and your background first, that's up to you. And you may want to A/B test it to see what works best for you over the long arc, but both are perfectly reasonable. Then what you'll notice that's common with both messages is this request for feedback. You're not trying to get a sales call. You're not telling them that you want to sell them your product. You're trying to request that they take the time to look at what you have and then share their advice, their insights, and their feedback. Many people are willing to do that for early stage companies because it's interesting, it's fun. Who doesn't want to see a new piece of technology and share their thoughts on it? And so I find that this is a lot more effective at getting meetings, but it's also authentic to the process we're going to run through once we get them on the phone. Similarly, your email message is not going to be much different. It's just, you just have more room to write a little bit more. Now, here is an example. This email is copy and paste the email I used when I was a founder at the early stage, before we had raised any money, when we had not even written a line of code yet. This is the exact email that got me Boeing as my first customer. This was a cold email to the global CIO of Boeing, and it worked. And again, first thing out of the gate is I'm positioning myself. I'm a recent Stanford graduate. Here's what I'm working on. I'd love to get your feedback. Can you share 20 minutes in the coming weeks? You're welcome to plagiarize this, by the way. Alternatively, here's one that's product forward. Hey, I'm working with a lot of people just like you, and let me tell you about this product that I'm building and why it matters. I'd love to give you, a demo and get your feedback on it. Can you spare 30 minutes in the coming weeks? Both have similar structures. Both are basically saying the same exact thing. One is just leading with who you are as the hook. The other one is leading with the product as the hook. So hopefully, you will have built these messages and you'll have these things canned and ready to go. My advice is get them ready before you start doing outreach, because what you want to avoid is a place where you feel like you're customizing these for every single person. And then you end up, with analysis paralysis. It does get a lot easier when you've got something that's good enough, in a canned way, and then you can just tweak it on the edges for every individual person, as opposed to writing it from scratch for everyone. Once you have the messages, you're going to go on LinkedIn. You're going to build a list. This is what professional salespeople do. They go on LinkedIn, they build lists. There's a tool in LinkedIn called Sales Navigator. I highly recommend it. It's depending on the tier you're at, I think it's anywhere from a few $dozen a month to to about $100 a month. So it's not free, but it is incredibly valuable, and I strongly recommend it. Once you're in Sales Navigator, you're going to have all these great features, but the most important features are there's going to be really advanced filters for you to try and identify the kinds of people, the profiles of people that you think are going to feel the most pain and be most likely to be your champions, so that they're most likely to respond to you and give you time. And then once you find this list of people, you're going to go through the results. And then for people that you do feel like they might be a fit, you can add them to lists. They call them lead lists. And here's what we're going to do. Once you have these lists, you really want to, you don't want to boil the ocean. You really want to try and do like 50 people at a time. You're going to go through LinkedIn, you're going to get like 2,500 results. You're not going to go through all of them. You're going to go through a few. And then the moment you get to like 50 people that you know you want to reach out to, you just pause. And then go through that list of 50 and start doing outreach. And what you're going to do is for each of those 50, you're going to take the messages we just talked about, and you're going to do a little bit of research for each of the 50, about their company, about their backgrounds, about their industry. The company's publicly traded. You might take a moment and look at their public announcements, like their 10Ks and 10Qs, to see if they've talked about future plans for the company. And then with that information, you're going to go back to these messages and see, is there anything that you want to tweak to make it more personal to them, to increase the chances they're going to respond, right? Again, maybe you're selling data science software and you want to reach out to McDonald's. And McDonald's just put out a press release, 3 months ago about how they're going to invest, $1 billion into being more data oriented. Or maybe you're building a new electric vehicle battery, and you just saw the news yesterday that Ford's going to spend $20 billion in conversions from traditional vehicles to electric vehicles. Those are the kinds of things that are gold to feed into these messages if you can find them. It's not required, but it'll help. And then what you're going to do, this is the most important piece, is you have to make time for this work. This work is a grind. I love to tell you it's not, but it is absolutely a grind. And so you've got to carve out dedicated big block of time. I recommend 4 hours a week. Just put one big 4-hour block on your calendar and just spend that time doing outreach. Not building the list, not writing your first message, but actually doing the outreach, trying to get a hold of these people by hook or by crook. And you should definitely use LinkedIn connections. You can, depending on your budget, you might consider using, what's called in-mail in LinkedIn, which is paid mail messages that have higher open rates. You should absolutely use email. And you'd be surprised, phone calls also work. And so figuring out someone's phone number, if you can get it, and just calling them up is effective for some people. And then depending on who you already know, or maybe you've already raised money, you should absolutely try and leverage your network. If you have investors, you should absolutely expect your investors to make introductions for you. We, for example, do it all day long for our portfolio companies, and we're not unique in that regard. And then you'd be surprised who's in your network. Maybe there's a very, very famous story. Microsoft, Bill Gates and Microsoft, the reason they even got started was they were able to land IBM as one of their first customers. Bill Gates's mother was the one that introduced them to IBM. And so you'd be surprised where you can get connections. And then once you start doing that outreach, regardless of the channel, whether it's introduction through friends or family or investors, or direct outreach through LinkedIn or email or phone, it's unlikely that the very first attempt is going to work. Your hit rate on the first, message is going to be low. The trick is to just keep following up. And so what I would do is, for this list of 50, mark where you are in the process. Hey, I just emailed them for the first time. 7 days later, email them again and be like, hey, I'm Alex. I'm just following up. I'd love to get your feedback. 2 weeks after that, follow up again. Hey, just checking in one more time, trying to see, I know you're really busy. I'd love to find time to get your feedback. This would be really valuable to me. And then after a month, if they still haven't responded, send one last message and be like, hey, I know you're busy. This is my last message. I'd love to get a hold of you. Thank you for any time you can provide. And then if after a month they don't respond, then cycle them out of your 50 target list. Just scratch them out or put them in some other list to show that you've already tried to reach out to them. And you're just going to keep cycling through this list of 50 based on who's responding and who's ultimately timing out. And again, this work is a grind. This is very, very difficult work. And it's very, very emotionally difficult. And so the trick that sales teams have figured out, decades ago, is that the way you keep the sales teams doing this really grindy work is you reward them. If you've ever been on a sales floor of a large company, man, there's bells going off. People are ringing bells, and there's balloons, and people are getting all kinds of awards and rewards, and there's leaderboards, and there's cheering, and there's all of this, manufactured reward system happening on a regular basis to incentivize the reps to continue to do this really, really difficult work that is critical to an organization having sales leads. And so you obviously aren't going to be on a sales floor. You're not going to have a sales manager doing all this work for you. You should do it for yourself. Reward yourself. Make it a game. What do you think you can do for yourself to reward yourself for spending 4 hours this week on outreach? What can you do for yourself to celebrate when you get that first customer to say, yes, I'll take a meeting? Maybe it's giving yourself 30 minutes of video game time, or maybe it's giving yourself a spa day, or, whatever it is, gamify it so that you are incentivized to keep coming back and doing the hard work. I've just scratched the surface on prospecting, which is ultimately what this is called. It's called prospecting. For those of you that want to double click deeper, there's a book that I recommend. It's called Fanatical Prospecting. It's what a lot of the salespeople that I've worked with have read and implemented. This stuff isn't rocket science, but this book does a good job of explaining how it all works. Okay, so you've been executing your outreach plan. You've got 50 people that you're hounding. You're hitting them on LinkedIn, you're hitting them on email, you're asking your friends and family to try and get a hold of them. You're following up, and then eventually someone says yes, they'll take a meeting. Okay, now what do you do? And so the first step is you have to prepare. When I was just out of undergrad, my first job was in sales, and I had the privilege of getting fantastic sales training from IBM. And they had this great quote, which is, failing to prepare is preparing to fail. And the point of that was, you should always be preparing for phone calls with customers. You should walk in knowing exactly how you want that call to go. And so the first step is to research the person and the organization you're going to meet with. To the degree that there's public information available, you should consume it. Maybe it's 30 minutes before, 30 minutes of research time. Maybe it's an hour of research time. It's ultimately your judgment how much research you want to do, but really try to understand, who is this person? What's their background? Where do they come from? Are they a CMU grad? Do they have any connection to Pittsburgh? Is there any affinity to you, or does their background maybe give you hints about the work they might be doing at their organization? Read about the industry. What's happening in the industry? What are the major changes happening? If it's an automotive company, for example, the switch to electric vehicles is a massive transition. If you're talking to an agriculture company, the switch to software and computer vision technology is enormous, right? What are the major things happening in the industry that might give you more insight and a leg up for the call? And then, of course, every publicly traded company is constantly talking about their future plans. And depending on the privately held company, they may or may not be also very vocal on where they're spending their time and energy. You might find those things on their blogs, or you might find those things in their quarterly reports to the SEC. Now, once you've done that research and have a sense of who this person is and what this company and industry are all about, set objectives for the phone call. What is that you want to get out of this call? What are the handful of questions that you need to get answered? And write them down and make sure that you hit those as fast as you can in the call so that you don't run out of time. And then lastly, prepare to manage the call. If any of you have ever been athletes, at a competitive level, you've probably sat down and visualized how a game is going to go. You visualize, the other team, trying to run their plays, and you running defense, and then the ball shifting over, and then you running offense and them running defense. And you kind of visualize the game to get yourself in the zone, so that when the game does start, you're already mentally there. That same concept applies to sales calls. Think about how the call is going to go. Think about the steps that it might go through. Think about the questions the customer might ask you. What are some of the objections they might throw at you, and how might you respond to them? Really, common ones are, hey, this is cloud-based. Can I trust you with my data? Or, oh, this is really expensive. Or, hey, how does this compare to, some other big company I might be looking at? So once you're prepared, you're going to go actually have the call. And here's the framework for how I like to run these hybrid customer discovery sales calls. And at the heart of it is the customer discovery framework that some of you may have seen through systems like, through programs like iCore, or there are other famous books like 4 Steps to the Epiphany that walk through this stuff. I think the author of the customer discovery framework is a gentleman by the name of Steve Blank. It's a great framework. I highly recommend it if you haven't already seen it, but I'll walk you through it now. The first step in the call, and in any customer discovery call, is to validate that you understand the customer's problems. Now, a professional salesperson wouldn't actually go through this framework. They'd be doing something very different. But because these are early stage calls and we're running a hybrid discovery sales call, we're going to start with the discovery framework, which is not what salespeople use. And so what I would start with here is take the opportunity to walk your customer through, or the prospect through, what you believe and understand are the 3 biggest problems that they might have. Hey, Mr. Customer, thanks for giving me time. I've been talking to a lot of data scientists in the last 3 months, and I believe that these are the 3 biggest problems that you might be struggling with. 1, 2, 3. What do you think? And have them validate or invalidate your understanding. Oh, Alex, you're right. This first problem is a really big deal. We are having a problem with ETL, or we are having a problem with scale. But this other issue, around cost, we're not really feeling that as much. This is a really high priority in my organization, and we have a pretty large budget. So, I'm not really feeling a cost issue. And this third one, I think you're getting it wrong. It's actually more like this instead of that, right? But really get their feedback, have them explain to you what their top 3 problems might be. And then once you have this conversation, assuming that you get to a place where you really do understand what they're struggling with, then you move on to validating your understanding of their alternatives. Hey, Mr. Customer, for the problems we just described, my understanding is that you're solving this today with custom code. You're building a bunch of custom software to jerry-rig what it is you want to achieve. That's one solution. The other one is you just do nothing. You just leave it alone, and you hobble along with what you have. Or the third option is, you go buy this really expensive product from, some Oracle or some other vendor. And, are these the alternatives that you're really looking at? And if so, here's what I think are the problems. When you custom build it, you're struggling because it's really expensive, it's hard to maintain, and you don't really have a lot of development resources available. So, you really hate that option, but it's kind of the only option you have. So that's what you're doing. Doing nothing is absolutely an option, but this is such a high priority and you're feeling so much pressure that you don't really have the luxury of doing nothing. Or maybe you do have the luxury of doing nothing, but doing nothing is very expensive. You're missing out on all of this, revenue opportunity, or maybe doing nothing is meaning that you're not saving a bunch of money, or you're falling behind on competition. Or, whatever the third solution is, maybe it's another vendor. Hey, this vendor is great, but this vendor is old school. They're 20 years old software. It's super expensive, doesn't really fit your architecture. It's for sure an alternative, but not a very palatable one. And again, like in the first column, have them validate or invalidate these assumptions. They might tell you, hey, look, that vendor that you think isn't very good, actually, it's great. We like it. We've implemented it. It was really easy. The price was right. We're satisfied. That's may not be what you want to hear, but it's incredibly important to know what truth is. Or maybe they say, look, doing nothing isn't really an option. Here's our other alternative. Our other alternative is to solve the problem in another department. Maybe instead of solving it with data science, we're just solving it in the software engineering department in product. Or, maybe the marketing team is doing something else with their own tool suite to solve the problem. And then once you have an understanding of what their real alternatives are and what the advantages and disadvantages are of those alternatives, that's when you start talking about your product. Hey, Mr. Customer, okay, if I heard you right, you're struggling with problem 1, 2, and 3, and your alternatives are 1, 2, and 3, and those aren't great for these reasons. Let me explain to you what we do. We're product X, and we have these 3 features that are really important. We do X, we do Y, we do Z. Would this be interesting to you? How much do these features matter to you? Are we solving the right problem for you? If these features do what we say they can do, how valuable is that to you? And similarly to the first 2 columns, have the customer validate that what you're building matters. And you might be very surprised. They might tell you, hey, that first feature, I don't care about. That's not valuable. That's not going to solve my problem. Again, may not be what you want to hear, but incredibly important as you're learning more and more about what the market wants compared to what you're building. Feature 2 might be great. And I'd be like, man, that's the product. Man, if you can just give me feature 2, that's going to solve a lot of my problems. That's also incredibly important to hear. Now you know where to focus. And they might say, hey, feature 3, you're kind of half right. It's not really there yet. Maybe, instead of it going left, maybe if it went right, that'd be more valuable. Or maybe if it did a little bit more and had this extra feature, maybe you're missing feature 4 or feature 5. That's all great information for you to figure out where there might be a fit. Now, I'll pause here for a second, because this is really customer discovery 101. If you do this, and you do this with like 50 customers, you're going to learn an incredible amount. After the first dozen customers, you're going to have a really refined perspective on what the problems your customers really have are. And shortly after that, you're going to have a really refined perspective on what their alternatives are and why they're falling short and why they may not be good enough. And then with a few more conversations, you're going to have a hopefully very dialed in perspective on where your product may or may not fit this customer set and what features are probably going to matter most to them. Now, once you've gone through this conversation with the customer, then you're going to switch into sales mode. And the way you do that while still keeping to this notion of customer discovery is you have to figure out if they would pay you. And so the way I like to do it at this phase of startup is to ask them if they would pay you $1 million. Now, it may or may not be $1 million, but I would urge you to find a number that you think is at the edge of reason. Not ludicrous, but not a gimme, right? Something that you think the customer's going to say no to, but they're not going to laugh you out of the room. So would you pay me $1 million? The customer's going to say, no, I'm not going to pay you $1 million. Then you go, okay, great. What price would you pay me? Now, the reason I like to structure it this way is that it's forcing the customer to stop and think through what the relative value of your product is. Now, if you just ask a customer, hey, how much would you pay me? You're going to be dissatisfied with the answer, because most people's knee-jerk reaction is, I don't know. But if you get them to start thinking about a price to begin with, you throw a number like $1 million out, they're gonna get in that mindset just sheerly as a reaction to the number. They're going to get through a very quick, ROI, return on investment math in their head. $1 million, I would never pay that. This is, really only going to save me $100K a year. Great. Okay, then how much would you pay for that? Oh, I'd pay you $50K a year. Right. And so once a customer starts to give you a sense of how much they would pay, start to explore. They may not know the number, right? They may, I don't really know. That's okay. But at least get them to think out loud. How would they think about it? Well, if I did this, maybe I can save X amount a year. Or, well, this is really interesting. I have this other product that I pay, 100K a year for, and arguably your product's more valuable. So maybe it's 150. Like, just try and understand how they're thinking about the price justification in their heads? How are they structuring that return on investment or the justification to their boss, and be taking furious notes? And if they do give you a number, that's great, write it down. And this will give you a sense of whether or not they really care. Because one of the problems you'll run into that's infuriating for early stage companies is that everyone wants to help you, right? You're a CMU grad, everyone wants to help you. But the problem is that some of that help is misguided. A lot of people will think that the way they're going to help you is by giving you a pat on the back and cheering you on. That they're going to tell you your product's awesome. Not because it is, not because they want to buy it, but because they think that's what's going to be helpful for you to hear. And so by asking them whether or not they would pay and how much they would pay, you're forcing someone into an uncomfortable situation where they have to make a decision on whether or not it really is or isn't valuable to you. And that's incredibly important, because if it isn't valuable, that's an important data point for everything you just heard on the call. Now you know that this organization is not going to be your customer. But if they do think it will be valuable and they start to give you a sense of how much they would pay, even if they can't get to an exact number, you now know that you are delivering something this person finds valuable. And this organization is a candidate for being one of your first customers. They may or may not buy, but at this stage in the conversation, they're at least a candidate. Now, what you will find is that some people will just be incapable of answering the question, right? And be like, oh, I really don't know. I'm not comfortable giving you a number. I don't really handle the budget. That's really my boss's job. I really don't know. I don't know. I can't tell you. When you run into that, and you're going to run into it a lot, I like to ask the other extreme of the question. What if it were free? If my product were 100% free, you have to pay me a dime, would you buy it? Would you implement it? And would you use it? This is a really important question, because you will be very surprised to find out that there are many customers who will say no to this question. And the reason is that the purchase price of a piece of technology is almost never the majority of the actual cost to the organization for deploying and using that technology. I'll use a database as a great example. There are many free databases out there: MySQL, Postgres, open source MongoDB. Just because they're free doesn't mean devs are going to wake up in the morning and swap out their database, because they have to go educate themselves on how that database works, which is reading a lot of documentation. It's a lot of time for the dev. They have to go write code to integrate to it and get it working. They've got to go build a bunch of tests around it to make sure that it's working properly. They probably have to go do scalability and performance testing to make sure that it's going to fit what they want. Once they get it integrated and get it working, then they have to go through a change process. They have to go, work with the rest of the organization to deploy it and change anything else in their workflows that are going to be impacted by this new database. They're then going to have to go coordinate with all the other teams to get them educated on how this database works so they can properly manage it. And that's very, very, very expensive, even if the database is free. And that's true for almost any piece of technology, for any organization. And so by asking if they would buy it if it were free, you are still stress testing whether or not this organization thinks your technology is valuable to them or not. And if you hear no, and you're going to hear no, explore, understand why not. Is it that the cost of transition is too high? Is it that the value proposition isn't high enough? And that way you start to understand where you have limitations, or where you should segment out future customers. If they say, yeah, I would use it for free, but I don't know how much I would pay, that's still good too. You still have a candidate for a potential customer. And so, you can still lump them back in the bucket with the same people who told you they would pay, X price or Y price. So at the end of the call, and by the way, everything I just talked about is happening in one call, and you want that call to be no more than 30 minutes. It's very hard to get a customer to spend more than 30 minutes with you on a call. So you want to practice, getting all of that into 30 minutes. It does require some practice, it does require some discipline, and it requires you managing the customer on the call to make sure you don't rat hole on a particular item in the conversation. Make sure you're getting the questions you need answered. At the end of the call, you have to read the room. You have to figure out, how did this call go? If the person's telling you that they would not pay for it, it's not a priority for them, they don't really have the need, they don't really have the pain, this is a dead end. Thank them for the time and try and get value out of the call by asking them for introductions. Hey, I know this isn't something that you would use or buy, but do you know anybody who might find this valuable? Are there any people who you might introduce me to, whether at your organization or another organization? And even if they don't have introductions, maybe just simply ask them, hey, what kinds of people do you think might find this valuable? Get information out of them. They may or may not be right, take it with a grain of salt, but at least extract whatever value you can, even if this person is not going to be a customer. Now, if this person seems interested, if they think it's valuable, if they think it's going to solve part of their problem, if they would be like, yeah, I would pay for this and I'd pay X. Or if they say, look, I don't know how much I would pay, but be really interested in using it. Summarize everything you heard, right? Explain to them, hey, what I heard you say was you have these 3 problems and they're pretty big and here's why they're so important, right? And you have these 3 alternatives and they're not so good and you're not really happy about them and they're pretty expensive and they're falling short of what you need. Our product does these 3 things. And based on the conversation, it felt like that could be a really big benefit to you. I'd love to continue the conversation with you to see if you'd be open to be my pilot customer. And then check to see if they're interested in that. Some people would be very excited to be your pilot customers and explore that conversation. And some people might say, look, I think all of this is really interesting, but I'm not in a position to pilot new technology. And that's a perfectly reasonable answer. Like, if you were to go to Goldman Sachs, chances of them being your pilot on anything is very, very low, right? As an organization is, they're typically not super open to brand new tech that hasn't been vetted by other vendors. And that's perfectly reasonable. But that doesn't mean that there won't be another bank or another organization of similar or smaller size who would be very eager to be your pilot. So I would check for that. And then assuming all that goes well, you want to propose the next steps. Set up the following meeting while you still have them on the call. And now what that next meeting is really depends on you and what you need. It might be a deeper conversation. Hey, you know what? Why don't we find more time? So I really want to better understand, how your current stack is architected, or I really want to better understand this pain point that you identified for us. Or alternatively, it's, hey, let's go spend more time in a demo. Let me go walk you through the product. Let me go show you how I might set you up and how I might deliver the requirements that you have in my product. Whatever is most reasonable, propose it, check for alignment with the customer. Hey, does that make sense? Is that the right next step? And then try and pin down the time, if possible, on the call. Now, everything I've walked you through is very, very hard. And I don't want to make it sound like this, is going to be easy. This is incredibly challenging work. But what I hope I've shown is that it's not rocket science. There isn't a ton of complexity to the process. The most important thing is simply to get out there and do it, and force yourself to keep it up and run. And so to kind of recap, you really want to make sure you know who these targets are. Who is the ideal person that you want to be talking to in your customer set? Who are these champions who are going to be excited about what you're doing, and they're going to sell internally to be your pilots? Go build lists, right? Go spend time on LinkedIn or any other mechanism you want to use and start to build a meaningful list of people that you're going to be diligent about doing outreach on. Go craft a message that is short, sweet, and ask people to give you feedback and spend time with you for any reason, whether it's because your product sounds really cool or because you're a great CMU grad and everyone wants to spend time with you and help you. And then once you get on those phone calls, make sure you're preparing to have a very well managed phone call where you know the steps you're going to take. You have a strong framework that you've practiced that you're going to run the customer through. And then again, you got to get out there. You got to practice and you got to iterate. Your first few times at this aren't going to go very well. And that's okay, right? Take everything you learn and iterate. That way, the next time it's a little bit better. And I promise you, if you have dozens of these conversations, not only are you going to be an expert at it, but you're going to learn an incredible amount of where product market fit is going to be for your for your customers. And most importantly, you might land anywhere, from your first customer to the first 5 that you really need. So get out there and start running on this. So with that, I'll open up the questions.
Hi, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Yeah, I actually left a question on the chat, and also I have another question. So I guess when it comes to developing your product to sell to customer, you really have to understand the needs of the customers. And in the phase of the development, it's better to fit into the market or the customer's needs at a very early stage. But at that stage, you don't really have a deliverable product or prototype of your, I'll say, product that can be demonstrated to customers because it's a very early stage. And in that sense, how is it how do you think it's the at best stage of development that you can actually ask opinions or feedback from the customer? And the second question is, you said after you discover the problems the customer have, it's better to touch upon the alternative solutions than come up with your own solutions. But if you haven't really verified the problems the customer has because you're trying to get the feedback, how is it possible for you to have a solution which can, I would say, address their needs more concurrently or more precisely?
Yeah, that's a good question, or two good set of questions. Let me break them apart because I think there were 2 different questions. So the first one is, how do you go about this customer discovery and sales process before you have a product that they can play with? And then the second question, if I heard you right, is, you're just starting, so you don't really have a good grip on what the problem is or what the alternatives are. So how do you proceed without really knowing the answer to those questions?
All right.
Okay. So the first one, look, I'll tell you my own personal story. I landed my first 2 pilots without a line of code written of my software. And so that's not because, I had some magic, some magic in my pitch. It's because getting someone to play with the product is actually a pretty late step in the process, right? If we go back to, let me go back all the way here. If we go back to the buying process, here we go. People actually playing with your product is the 4th step in the buying process. And so you can get pretty far on diagrams, PowerPoints, conversation, whiteboarding sessions. You can get very far by simply communicating what it is your product's going to do. What you might even consider doing as well, if it's a software product, is mock-ups, right? When we landed our first few customers, landed's a strong word. When we got the first few people to agree to be our pilots, we were showing them mock-ups. We weren't showing them actual product. We were showing them the direction we were going in. And for those early customers, that was good enough for them to agree to be our pilots. Now, to be clear, many customers, in fact, most customers, aren't going to be comfortable spending a lot of time with you when your product is either not built yet, or not something that's already working at another customer. And that's okay. You're not trying to get a bunch of customers. You're trying to get just the first few. And so part of what you're implicitly filtering for are the customers who are going to be willing to lean in and be your pilot as you're building it. So I don't think it's a problem as long as you can still communicate clearly how the product's going to work and what it's going to do. To your other question of, how do you have these customer discovery questions if you don't really know what the problems and the alternatives are? Look, honestly, I mean, that's on you, right? Like you have to sit down and form a hypothesis of what you believe the problems are. Now, what you might do is you might go call on a few people in your network to go understand the problem. That's okay. Like, the model I'm laying out here is not how you should research the market. This is more about how do you find your first 5 customers. And so you can absolutely go out and have a very different conversation with customers to understand their pain points, to inform your hypothesis before you go into this model. But regardless, set a hypothesis. I'm going to guarantee you your hypothesis is going to be wrong. And that's okay, right? That's the whole point of this, is you're going to put a hypothesis down. It's not going to be 100%, but the more and more you talk to people, you're going to learn where it's wrong and where it's right. And then you're going to start to hear the right answers more and more and more, which is why I'm such a big advocate of having 50 plus conversations, because it doesn't take that many to start to zero in on what the real problems are and where the real gaps and alternatives are, if there are gaps.
All right, thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Alex, I have a question if nobody else does.
Yeah.
Mine might be a little off a little bit, so I want to be the last one if other people have them.
No, by all means, go for it.
Can introduce me to a board member of a company that we feel would be an ideal customer. But his question is, what do we want to put in front of him and what's the ask? I don't know, as a board member, I don't know what his fiduciary responsibilities are to the company and what he can actually do. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, I mean, in a perfect world, what you can get out of a board member is an introduction to the CEO, which is ideal, or whoever the C-level executive is who's most appropriate. So it might be the CFO or the CTO or whatever it is you think is most appropriate, but at a minimum, it's a CEO. And then to the degree that you have a relationship with that board member, they can give you insight into the priorities of the organization. What are they dealing with? What are the opportunities they're trying to go after? What are the problems they're trying to solve? And that'll give you context going into whatever meeting is. Once you get introduced, or once your message or whatever it is that they're going to pass on to the CEO or the C-level, that will most likely get routed down to the right person. This is actually a good tee up. I personally like to reach out to really senior people in an organization, whether it's the CEO or the CTO or something like that, because even though they're probably not the right person, and they almost never are, they know exactly who is. And so they can route it to the right person very quickly without you blindly trying to hit everybody on LinkedIn to try and identify the right person. And I'll give you a really good example is Boeing. That message I showed you earlier about my cold outreach to the global CIO of Boeing, that person was absolutely not the right person. But the way that interaction went down was the global CIO routed it down to the executive that was working on a related project. And that executive reached out to me and said, hey, this is interesting. Let's get on a conversation. And then he put me in contact with his deputy who was running point on the project. And so that's what I would shoot for in this conversation, is get the board member to introduce you to the CEO or pass along your information to the CEO, and then hope that the CEO will route you down to the right person in the organization to take a meeting with you.
To just a follow-up question on his question, Devin's question. So regardless of the size of the company, it's much strategically better to approach to like a senior boarding members or like C-level people to be routed to whoever can like handle my request, right?
I mean, it depends. So I would say all of the above. I as much success as I've had reaching out to CEOs and C-levels, I've also had a tremendous amount of success reaching out directly to the director level managers who are the ones who most generally own projects. And so I don't know that I would narrow your focus there just yet until you learn a whole lot more.
What about like job positions that handle suppliers like procurement or purchasing managers? Would that be right people to address?
You know, my general experience with procurement people is, you know, they're not really good at this.
Okay.
What procurement people are very good at is they are very good at managing a vendor relationship once the line of business has decided that they want to work with that vendor.
Right, I agree.
It's the line of business that makes the decision, and then procurement gets involved. And procurement is really there to make sure that we're doing business with you in the right way, that the contracts are correct, that I'm getting the best pricing I can get out of you. And so, but they very rarely understand the business needs, and they very rarely have a voice in what vendors are evaluated. They're more of like a program manager on large purchases.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Alex.
Yeah, my pleasure. Any other questions?
Alex, do you have an opinion on sending pitch decks or anything, or do you only do you retain those for yourself and so that you can actually pitch the pitch deck in conjunction with your pitch?
So we're talking about customers, not venture capitalists, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So for customers, yeah, I don't like to send decks over for customers for two reasons. One, they're not going to read them. And then because they're just so busy, right? You're asking them to do work. But then also, it's very hard to communicate the nuances of your product in slides.
Gotcha.
And so, I would send over, a short, I showed you the messages. I would send over something very short and sweet that will hopefully explain what it is you do, and just try and get on the phone with them. Because again, the goal in this process is to not just find a customer, but to also do customer discovery, right? It's this hybrid approach that you're ultimately trying to strive for. And the only way you get any kind of discovery information is if you're on the phone with somebody and asking them questions.
Gotcha.
This might be sorry. Is there a word?
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to ask something, Alex, just piggybacking on, this early stage selling. And I think the star, for me represents, sometimes you have your user who might not be the buyer as well. So I think what you're targeting is, the user who's also a buyer, where you can get that, both perspective. Is that what we're trying to do mostly here? At least that's what I'm hearing and taking away.
Oh, that's a great question. So the answer is not exactly. You're trying to find the person who's going to have not just the most pain, but the most juice, if you will, to sell it internally. Now, it might be a user, but it might not be. Right? I can think of many scenarios where the user has very, very little say in the decision. So it really just depends. And that's part of the value you'll get as you talk to more and more people. And I'll give you a really good example. A friend of mine has a company selling sales software for salespeople. And for the first 6 months, he was taking it to the individual sales reps, the users. And he was getting tremendous feedback. Everyone said, "This is awesome. I want to use it. This is great." And then they would sign up, but then nothing else would happen. Right? Not many of them would pay, and very few of them would ever get their co-workers using it as well. And then eventually they said, "You know what? We're going to go to the sales managers and the sales VPs, the sales executives." And they started talking to the sales executives. And then they realized that the sales executives had their own set of pains and their own set of priorities for this. And the big difference was those guys had authority. And so all of a sudden, everything changed. They started to get traction in the sales organizations, not by selling to the user, but by selling to the ultimate decision maker, who was ultimately the economic buyer. So it really just depends. And, and I could give you examples going in every different direction. The point is, you want to find the people who are going to not only feel the biggest pain, but also have the ability to sell for you internally and get movement.
Perfect. Thanks.
Other questions?
Okay. If we don't have any other questions, Alex, thanks so much for coming. This was great. We had a lot of great questions today.
Thank you for the time. I appreciate it.
All
Thanks,
right.
Thank you
Alex.
for your
Great stuff.
time. Thank you.